Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we're having a look at some fascinating training materials from the Second World War. Specifically, these were used to teach the fine art of aircraft recognition. So if you were a fighter pilot, an aerial gunner aboard a bomber, an anti-aircraft gunner, or a civilian observer, such as a member of the British Royal Observer Corps, you needed to be able to identify aircraft and tell friend from foe from a great distance and in various visibility conditions, so as to not A, fire upon friendly aircraft, or B, fail to fire upon hostile ones. And as the speed of aircraft continued to increase throughout the war, the window of time in which you had to make a positive identification continued to shrink. And so it became very important to be able to identify aircraft very quickly, almost instinctively. And given the sheer number of aircraft deployed during the war, this was a non-trivial skill to learn. And so throughout the war, various training materials were devised in order to expedite this process. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, the first formal aircraft observation organizations were formed during the First World War in Britain in response to German Zeppelin and later Gotha bomber raids, starting with the Metropolitan Observer Service in 1917. And this eventually evolved into the Royal Observer Corps, which was formally organized in 1925. However, these early organizations didn't have any sort of formal system for teaching aircraft recognition. And the need for this type of training became very clear in 1939 following the September 6th Battle of Barking Creek, in which a case of mistaken identity resulted in 2 British Hawker Hurricane fighters being shot down and 1 pilot being killed. And so in 1940, the chief observer of the Royal Observer Corps, C.H. Gibbs Smith, came up with a unified training doctrine known as the WEFT System. Now, WEFT stands for Wings, Engine, Fuselage, and Tail. And the idea was that a student would break down each aircraft into those components and memorize all the similarities and differences between them, and then reassemble all of that into a unified picture of each aircraft that would allow them to tell different aircraft apart and recognize them almost instantly. So, for example, if you see a twin-engine heavy fighter coming towards you, you would break it down into those components. So, are the wings rounded or squared off? Are the engines radials or are they inline? Is the fuselage long and narrow or is it shorter and fatter? And does the tail have 1 vertical stabilizer or 2? Depending on your answer, this could be either a British Bristol Beaufighter or a German Messerschmitt Bf 110. Now, all sorts of training aids were devised to teach the WEFT system, but almost all of these comprise 3-view or orthographic silhouettes showing the aircraft from the front, from the top or the bottom, and from the side. Now, 3/4 views are sometimes often used, but the general idea was that a student would study the orthographic views and build up a 3D picture in their head that they could then identify from any possible angle. And the vast majority of these materials were intended for individual study, with the contemporary literature insisting that up to 90% of aircraft recognition training should take place outside of the classroom. And students were encouraged to collect scrapbooks of various Allied and enemy aircraft and to hold regular aircraft recognition competitions with their colleagues. Now, the WEFT system was soon officially adopted by the Royal Observer Corps and the RAF and quickly made its way across the Atlantic, being officially adopted by the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1941. Now, at the same time, the U.S. Navy used a similar system called the 3-point identification system for recognizing ships at sea. And this involved memorizing the various differences between the bow, the hull shape, and various superstructure details such as funnels, turrets, and bridges. Unfortunately, however, it quickly became apparent that the WEFT system was seriously flawed. For example, by only focusing on those 4 sections of an aircraft, wings, engine, fuselage, and tail, and then only on those details that could be easily described or named, the WEFT system potentially left out a host of useful details that could be used to identify an aircraft. Also, a lot of these details that students had to spend so much time memorizing were shared among many different aircraft, making a lot of this work redundant and potentially leading to misidentifications. So for example, going back to our twin-engine heavy fighter example, if you go methodically through the WEFT system, you'll find that the only really apparent difference between these two aircraft is that one has rounded wingtips and one has squared-off wingtips. Also, the cockpit shape is a little bit different, but these details might not be that apparent at a great distance or at high speed, potentially leading you to misidentify a friendly Yakovlev Yak-4 as a Messerschmitt Bf-110. Indeed, a common joke among airmen at the time was that WEFT stood for wrong every time. And instructors also hated the WEFT system because so many of these details were shared among different aircraft that a lot of the time spent studying them was seen as redundant and wasteful. Now, in response to these shortcomings, in 1942, one Samuel Renshaw of Ohio State University came up with an alternative training system, which he called, naturally, the Renshaw System. Now, unlike WEFT, which emphasized memorizing individual details of an aircraft's design, the Renshaw system emphasized perceiving the entire aircraft as a unified whole, what we might call in psychology the gestalt. It also made extensive use of what were known as tachyscopic training methods, where students would be exposed to very brief flashes of an aircraft silhouette or photograph, with the length of that flash being reduced over the course of the training as the student's proficiency improved. The idea being that if you're a fighter pilot or a gunner aboard a bomber aircraft, you're going to have a very brief window of time in which to identify an aircraft and take appropriate action. Consequently, you needed to become almost subconsciously attuned to the overall character of an aircraft, not only what it looked like from every conceivable angle, but also what it sounded like, how it moved, things like that. Indeed, a similar principle is used in the hobby of birdwatching. So birdwatchers will describe the overall character of a bird, both its shape and its coloration, also the way that it moves on the ground and in the air, as its jizz. And yes, that is the actual term that they use. They really need to come up with a better one. Anyway, the U.S. military was convinced by these arguments, and in 1942, the U.S. Navy officially adopted the Renshaw system, with the U.S. Army Air Force following the following year. However, the Renshaw system turned out to be based mostly on conjecture and assumption, and when it was subjected to empirical investigation, it was found to be just as flawed as the earlier WEFT system. So, for example, combat reports revealed that most observers and gunners were able to identify an aircraft several minutes before it came into firing range, making instantaneous identification unnecessary. It was much better to identify an aircraft accurately than it was to do so quickly. At the same time, one J.J. Gibson of the Armed Forces Aviation Psychology Program conducted a series of experiments in which he exposed students to these tachyscopic slides of various aircraft silhouettes with durations lasting 1/110th, and 1/50th of a second. What he found was that the best results were obtained with the longer duration slides, the 1 1/10th of a second. Whereas those who were exposed to the fastest slides at 1/50th of a second did slightly worse on the standard Renshaw recognition test, completely undermining the basis of the Renshaw system. He also found that exposing students to WEFT-style study of aircraft design details early in training improved outcomes later on. And so for this reason, the Navy and the Air Force later adopted a hybrid system where students would start out with WEFT-style instruction before moving on to Renshaw-style tachyscopic instruction. Now, the development of aircraft recognition training methods continued well into the post-war period, with two of the most popular systems developed during this time being the Sargent system, developed in 1956 by Charles Sargent, editor of the Joint Services Recognition Journal, and the Humro system, developed by the Human Resources Research Office at Fort Bliss in Texas. But that's a bit beyond the scope of this video. What's important here is that by the late 1950s and the 1960s, jet aircraft were flying so fast and so high that traditional aircraft recognition by eye was becoming a bit impractical. And so identification friend or foe, or IFF, was largely taken over by electronic systems. However, aircraft recognition and recognition of other types of vehicles, such as tanks or ships, was still useful to, say, pilots flying over enemy territory and seeing aircraft on the ground, or sailors out at sea, or soldiers spotting enemy vehicles on the ground, or for the interpretation of reconnaissance photographs. And so aircraft and vehicle recognition in general continued to be taught, and indeed is still taught to this day, albeit on a much smaller scale than during the Second World War. And if you want to learn more about the subtle art of aerial reconnaissance photo interpretation, please check out my previous video on the publication Evidence in Camera, link in the description. Right, so let's finally have a look at some of the training materials that I have assembled here. So throughout the Second World War, a number of periodicals were published to keep airmen and observers up to date on the latest developments in aircraft technology, and also to keep their aircraft recognition skills sharp. And one of the main publications was Aircraft Recognition, the Inter-Services Journal. So this grew out of various informal associations of Royal Observer Corps volunteers, which popped up during the 1920s and 30s and became known as Harkers Clubs. And these clubs, which were combined in 1941 into a unified association known as the Royal Observer Corps Club, produced some of the first formal aircraft recognition training materials, tracing silhouettes out of copies of the Aeroplane magazine or cigarette cards. They also organized formal aircraft recognition competitions and standardized tests with 3 recognized achievement levels. Third class, which meant you could identify at least 50% of aircraft accurately. Second class, which meant you could identify at least 70% of aircraft accurately. And first class, which meant you could identify 90% or more of aircraft accurately. The club published a biweekly journal known as the Airplane Spotter, which was later renamed the Journal of the Royal Observer Corps Club. In the autumn of 1942, the club was disbanded, but the journal continued publication under the Royal Observer Corps proper, being renamed the Royal Observer Corps Journal and finally Aircraft Recognition, the Inter-Services Journal. The club's standardized testing and proficiency rankings were also officially adopted by the ROC, with members having to attain at least a third-class rating in order to remain in the organization. And the ROC would continue to compete in international aircraft recognition competitions against other NATO countries until 1991, even though aircraft spotting had been removed from their mandate in 1957 in favor of monitoring nuclear detonations and the drift of fallout in the wake of a nuclear attack. And to learn more about this, I've linked to a couple of period videos on the Royal Observer Corps' role during the Cold War, as well as to my own videos on the Canadian equivalent, the Nuclear Detonation and Fallout Reporting System, or NDFRS, which I've been studying for several years, so please check it out. Now, wartime issues of aircraft recognition contained all sorts of different articles, including profiles of individual aircraft, breakdowns of technical details such as all the different types of aircraft engines, updates on new development in aircraft technology or the deployment of various aircraft to various theaters of the war, and of course, lots and lots of quizzes. And I thought it might be fun to test your World War II aircraft knowledge by subjecting you to one of these quizzes. So this particular example comes from the March 1944 issue of Aircraft Recognition and consists of 20 silhographs, or aircraft silhouettes traced from photographs. So I'm going to leave this up for 30 seconds. Best of luck. No cheating now. All right, that's time. Let's see how you did. Number 1, Hawker Hurricane. Number 2, Grumman F6F Hellcat. Number 3, Short Stirling. Number 4, Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik. Number 5, Gotha GO244. Number 6, Avro Lancaster. Number 7, Supermarine Spitfire. Number 8, Bristol Beaufighter. Number 9, Messerschmitt Bf-110. Number 10, Junkers Ju-290. Number 11, Dornier Do-217. Number 12, Curtiss C-46 Commando. Number 13, Blohmen Voss BV-138. Number 14, Consolidated B-24 Liberator. Number 15, Mitsubishi G4M Betty. Number 16, Blohmen Voss BV-222. Number 17, Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. Number 18, Nakajima B-5N Kate. Number 19, Lockheed Ventura. And finally, number 20, Messerschmitt Me-323. Okay, so if you found that a little bit hard, let's try something maybe a little bit easier. This is a quiz from the November 1944 issue of Air Cadet magazine, which consists of 23 photographs instead of silhographs, which contain more detail that might be more useful for identifying the aircraft. So once again, I'm going to leave this on screen for 30 seconds. Best of luck. And time's up. Did you get number 1, Hawker Hurricane, number 2, Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, number 3, Bristol Beaufort, number 4, Douglas C-47 Skytrain or Dakota, number 5, Waco CG-4 Hadrian, number 6, Douglas SBD Dauntless, number 7, Vickers Wellington, number 8, Grumman F-6F Hellcat, number 9, Hawker Typhoon, number 10, Vought F-4U Corsair, number 11, Lockheed P-38 Lightning, number 12, Heinkel HE-115, number 13, Lavochkin Gorbunov Gudkov Lag-3, number 14, Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally, number 15, Arado AR-196, number 16, Martin PBM Mariner, number 17, Martin B-26 Marauder, number 18, Heinkel HE-111, number 19, Dornier DO-217, number 20, Avro Lancaster, number 21, Messerschmitt Bf-109, number 22, Junkers Ju-88, and finally, number 23, Vickers Warwick. And finally, before we move on, every issue of Aircraft Recognition included a feature called On the Spot, in which readers were challenged to tell apart two very similar aircraft silhouettes. For example, if you were the gunner on this universal carrier, which aircraft would you shoot at? The answer is the aircraft on the left, which is a German Fiesler Fi-156 Stork, while the other is a British Oster AOP. Now, how about this one? Which aircraft would you direct anti-aircraft batteries or fighters to shoot at? In this case, the answer is the one on the right, which is a German Heinkel HE-111, while the other is a British de Havilland Mosquito. Yeah, I couldn't tell them apart either. Right, so in addition to periodicals, there are also a number of official aircraft recognition manuals published throughout the war, a number of examples of which I have here. These contain all sorts of information, including the standard 3-view silhouettes, perspective drawings and in-flight photographs, descriptions of key statistics like length, wingspan, engine type, and other design features, and summaries of national markings. Now, some of these guides focused on aircraft of a particular nation, while others combined several nations into one volume. Often these were also divided up by aircraft type, fighters, bombers, transports, patrol aircraft, etc. Now, an interesting detail to note on some of these guides is the warning not to be taken into the air. This is so that if an aircraft was shot down over enemy territory, the enemy would not be able to capture these recognition journals and find out what we knew about their aircraft. Now, one final fun detail that I discovered in one of these manuals, specifically this one on Portuguese aircraft, is that the Portuguese Air Force had 6 B-24 Liberators. Now, these were not actually officially purchased, but were rather American aircraft that were forced to make an emergency landing in Portugal, and Portugal, being neutral, impounded these aircraft and later integrated them into their Air Force. And as I mentioned before, despite most military aircraft becoming too fast and high-flying to feasibly identify by sight, aircraft recognition continued to be taught well into the post-war era. And here we have a number of different editions of the Observer's Guide to Aircraft from 1952, 1955, 1956, and 1962. Now, another very common training aid that was produced during the war were flashcards, and I have a number of different examples here, all of which appear to have been hand-cut from larger printed sheets. And most of these have the traditional 3-view silhouettes of varying degrees of quality. Some of them have 3/4 views, some of them have actual photographs. Some of them have full descriptions of the aircraft on the back of the card, whereas others are blank or have ruled lines for you to write your own descriptions and other information. And if you're wondering, the initialism NACIOS here, or NACIOS, stands for the Naval Combat Intelligence Officers School. Also widely manufactured were ordinary sets of playing cards with aircraft silhouettes printed on them. The idea being that students would be able to practice their aircraft recognition skills while playing ordinary card games in their downtime. Now, this particular set here comes with 4 decks, which are color-coded according to the types of aircraft depicted within. Red for single-engine aircraft, blue for multi-engine aircraft with a single vertical stabilizer, orange for multi-engine aircraft with twin vertical stabilizers, and green for miscellaneous aircraft. So each deck contains 53 cards, 13 suits of 4 cards showing 4 different views of a particular aircraft, and 1 joker, which shows multiple views of a single aircraft. And because none of these cards are numbered, this could be used to play any sort of regular card game that didn't involve building sequences or collecting different numbers. And indeed, the included instruction manual gives a number of suggestions, including Snap, Rummy, and Clock Patience, which is a particularly complicated form of solitaire. You'll also notice that the names of the aircraft are not actually printed on the cards themselves, but are rather given in a separate pamphlet supplied with each deck. So, you know what time it is now? I think it's quiz time. So in the spirit of the Renshaw system, I'm going to show you rapid-fire images of all 4 views from each suit, and you're going to have to identify the aircraft. Ready, set, go. Okay, I started off with a softball. As soon as you see those beautiful elliptical wings, you should know instantly that this is the Supermarine Spitfire. All right, next aircraft. Okay, this one's a little bit harder, but by no means obscure. The Lockheed Hudson, the light bomber and coastal patrol version of the Lockheed 14 airliner. Next. Okay, another really easy one. This, of course, is the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. All right, let's do a little bit of a harder one. All right, this one was known under 2 different names, the Douglas A-20 Havoc in American service or the Boston in British service. Okay, let's do one that's a little bit more difficult. All right, this one's a bit more obscure, but you might be familiar with it if you've read lists of the worst aircraft of World War II. This is the Brewster F-2A Buffalo, the U.S. Navy's first modern monoplane fighter. Though adopted by the U.S. Navy, Royal Air Force, Royal Netherlands East Indies Army Air Force, and the Finnish Air Force, only the Finns managed to use it effectively. Everywhere else, it was quickly outmatched by far superior Japanese aircraft. All right, let's move on. All right, this one should be a little bit easier. This is the Mach-E C-200 Saetta, one of Italy's main wartime fighter aircraft. All right, next. Easy, right? That's the iconic Avro Lancaster. Only, no, it isn't. Note that it has only 2 engines, not 4. This is actually the Avro Manchester, the Lancaster's immediate predecessor. All right, let's try another hard one. Maybe you recognize this one as the Caproni CA-311, an Italian light bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. All right, you probably recognize this as the iconic Messerschmitt Bf-109, right? Well, nope. This is actually the Bf-109's unsuccessful rival, the Heinkel HE-100, which despite setting the world airspeed record in 1939, was not ordered into series production because the German government decided to concentrate fighter development at Messerschmitt and bomber development at Heinkel. All right, last one. And finally, this is the Westland Whirlwind, a British heavy fighter and ground attack aircraft introduced in 1940. Now, despite being a very effective aircraft, development problems with its engines led to only a small number being produced, and they were all withdrawn from service by 1943. All right, that's the last quiz we're going to have for the rest of the video, I swear. Anyway, in addition to playing cards, a number of other games were devised during the war in order to teach aircraft recognition in a fun manner, including the delightfully named Spotto, which is basically an aircraft recognition themed game of bingo. So this was intended to be played by 3 or more players, with 1 player acting as the caller. So the other 2 players would get 1 or more of these cards with aircraft silhouettes printed on them. So to start a round, the caller would yell out contact and then pull out and read one of these little tokens, which has the name of an aircraft written on it. Then if one of the other players recognizes that aircraft in the silhouettes on their cards, they would yell out Spotto and place that token on the appropriate silhouette. And the game would end when one of the players managed to fill out their card. Now, in addition to cards, books, and posters, another common way of displaying aircraft silhouettes and other training materials was using a projector. And here we have a set of cellulose acetate transparencies showing British and German aircraft. So these were intended for use in something called a diascope, which today we would recognize as an overhead projector. But an instructor could also project regular opaque photographs onto a screen using something called an episcope, or alternatively an epidiascope, which combine both functions into the same unit. And as I mentioned in a previous video, link in the description, at the beginning of the war, the US military purchased thousands of the newly invented Viewmaster stereoscopes in order to teach vehicle recognition. And while I don't have any of the original training reels here, I do have this Model B Viewmaster, which was introduced in 1944 and would have been used in the latter months of the war. Now, while reasonably effective, all of the methods that we've discussed so far suffered from the same shortcoming, which is that they could only display a relatively limited number of angles of any given aircraft, whereas a pilot or an observer would be expected to encounter aircraft from any number of angles, which is why one of the most effective and popular means of teaching aircraft recognition was through the use of models. Now, during the war, aircraft recognition models were manufactured by a wide variety of companies, with two of the first being the British firms A.J. Holiday & Company and International Model Aircraft Limited, both of which were founded in the early 1930s. Now, the former produced a line of balsa wood kits under the brand name Skybirds. Meanwhile, International Model Aircraft Limited started out producing rubber band-powered flying models under the brand name Frog, allegedly standing for Flies Right Off the Ground, but later produced some of the world's first injection-molded plastic model kits. And these were made out of a plastic known as cellulose acetate, which was originally developed as a much safer alternative to the highly flammable cellulose nitrate used in motion picture film. And these models were sold under the brand name Frog Penguin in reference to the fact that these models were non-flying. Now, when the Second World War broke out, both firms were contracted to build aircraft recognition models. And since the Skybirds kits had to be hand-carved, in order to keep up with demand, the government turned to school children as well as other civilians to produce these models. And a similar program was launched in the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor, with the US Navy putting out a call for 500,000 aircraft recognition models for the war effort. And they produced standardized kits as well as templates and instructions and distributed these all across the country. However, despite thousands of enthusiastic school children and other patriotic citizens participating in this program, they didn't come close to producing the sheer number of models required. And this is mainly because most of the models submitted didn't fit the government's strict standards for accuracy and consistency. After all, a lot of them were being made by children. And so most of them ended up being rejected. And the vast majority of models used during the war were mass-produced by established firms, including Frog, CMA, Astral, TrueScale, Strombecker, Comet, Merecraft, and Kruver. And while the vast majority of these models were molded out of plastics like Bakelite or more commonly cellulose acetate, a number of other materials were also used depending on availability, including nylon, cast metal, and a plaster of Paris Hessian composite material called buckram, which was press molded around a T-shaped metal frame. And as you can imagine, these latter models were very fragile and it is very rare to find them today. Now, by the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of aircraft recognition models had been manufactured, representing over 220 different aircraft types. And significantly, most of these were manufactured in 1/72nd scale, in which 1 inch on the model represents 6 feet in real life, about the height of a person. And this was introduced by Frog and was selected because it allowed even the largest aircraft in use at the time be represented at a reasonable size. So, for example, the largest wartime aircraft that they made a recognition model out of, the Blumenvoss BV-222 flying boat, had a wingspan of 63.5 centimeters or 25 inches. And while a number of other scales were used throughout the war, including 1/48th, 1/75th, and 1/100th, 1/72nd became the de facto standard, both during and after the war. And indeed, even today, 1/72nd scale and 1/48th scale are the two most common scales you encounter for model aircraft. And so if you build models yourself, as I do, and you ever wondered where those scales come from, well, there you go. However, in the post-war period, as aircraft grew ever larger, even a 1/72nd scale started to become a little unwieldy. So in the post-war period, the US Air Force switched to 1/144th scale, half of 1/72nd scale, in order to save space. And today this scale is commonly used for models of commercial airliners. But even this proved to be a little bit too space-consuming, so the Air Force switched again to 1/432nd scale models molded in gray plastic, hence their collector's nickname of post-war grays. And I have an example of one of these models here, specifically of a Republic F-84 Thunderjet, which first entered service in 1947. And the molds for these quickly made their way onto the commercial market. And interestingly, these models were offered as prizes in boxes of Kick cereal. Right, so let's have a look at some of these wartime recognition models that I have here. Some of these are carved out of wood, others are molded out of cellulose acetate. The vast majority of these would have been painted flat black in order to simulate the appearance of an aircraft at a distance, though later in the war this was changed to light gray. And I said that I wouldn't subject you to any more quizzes, but what the heck? Let's see if you can identify these aircraft from their models. Okay, this one is easy. Of course, it's another Supermarine Spitfire. This particular model is carved out of wood, and given the slightly crude finishing and inaccurate contours, this might have been one produced by a schoolchild or at least an airman or other non-professional carver. Alright, here's a slightly harder one. Now, at first I thought this was a Hawker Sea Fury, but this is actually an early Hawker Tempest Mark II fighter with a Bristol Centaurus radial engine. This model is also carved out of wood, but is of significantly better quality than the Spitfire. Now, this one is a little bit more obscure, but very distinctive. This is a Fairey Barracuda, a British carrier-borne torpedo and dive bomber. All right, now we're getting into the cellulose acetate models, in this case, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The majority of these that you'll find on the market were produced by the Kruver Company of Chicago, and you can see their trademark, a C in a circle, molded into the bottom of the model. As you can imagine, these are often mistaken for copyright marks. The name of the aircraft is also often molded in, as is the date of manufacture, though not in this particular case. Something else to note on this model is the severe distortion around the lower cowling that you can see here. See, cellulose acetate is a fairly unstable plastic, and when improperly stored, can quickly start to melt or break apart, producing a very distinctive vinegar smell as it releases acetic acid. This particular damage is actually not all that bad, but I've seen other models that are just completely disintegrated beyond repair. So if you own any of these models, be sure to keep them in a cool, dry place. All right, here's a nice big one that you'll recognize as a Vickers Wellington medium bomber. This particular model being manufactured in September 1942, and another easy one, this case a Hawker Typhoon ground attack aircraft manufactured in June 1943. Next, we have a much more obscure aircraft. This is a Focke-Wulf FW-187 Falke heavy fighter, which was introduced in 1935 but never accepted for widespread service, with only 9 examples being made. This particular model was manufactured in August 1942. And finally, we end on another British carrier-borne aircraft, the Fairey Fulmar. Unlike the others we've looked at, this particular model has been painted, though I'm not sure whether this was done during or after the war. See, after the war, these models were sold cheaply by the hundreds of thousands in surplus stores and toy stores. Many of them were purchased by children who often painted them to look more accurate. And finally, another type of recognition model that was commonly manufactured during the war was this type, where the parts are die cut out of a piece of thick cardboard, and you had to cut or punch these out and slot them together to form a model that, while not very convincing at close range, would have produced acceptably accurate silhouettes at a distance. So a very clever and economical means of mass-producing aircraft recognition models. Now, there were numerous ways that an instructor could use models to teach aircraft recognition. He could simply hold the models up in front of the class, could hand them out to the students to study on their own, or he could use a special projector called a shadowgraph to produce custom silhographs of different angles. However, there was also a far more sophisticated piece of training equipment called the Hunt Range Trainer, which took up an entire Quonset or Nissen hut on many air bases. Now, I haven't been able to find any photographs or diagrams of this device, but from the few descriptions I've been able to track down, it consisted of a large cyclorama with simulated cloud effects and colored lights that could be adjusted to simulate different visibility conditions, and inside to be suspended various aircraft models posed at different angles. Now, these students sat with their backs to the proscenium arch of the cyclorama, facing a mirror that could be moved by the instructor to simulate the movement of the aircraft behind them across their field of vision, and they would be quizzed on what aircraft they had just seen move across their field of vision. Now, what makes the Hunt Range Trainer particularly interesting is that apparently they were not mass-produced standardized pieces of kit. Rather, they were improvised by each individual airbase using available materials. So if any of you have any further information on these, especially photographs and diagrams, please send them my way. I would love to see them. This sounds like an absolutely fascinating piece of kit. Anyway, that, dear viewers, is a brief summary of aircraft recognition training during the Second World War. This is an absolutely huge subject with a lot of different nuances and a lot more equipment than what I showed you here. But if we went into it in any more detail, we would be here all day. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and a huge shout out to my friend Matt Heinz, who supplied all of the items that we had a look at today. I've covered a lot of other items from his extensive collection in previous videos, including bubble sextants, astrographs, radar chaff, all that good stuff. So if you're interested in World War II aviation equipment, please check out my back catalog. Now, I will see you next time in another video or look at yet more training devices and other fascinating devices just like these. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.